And we are very pleased to have Maitre Julius Gray with us today as part of our project, our ongoing project of interviewing a cross-section of English Quebec. Thank you very much, Mr. Gray, for agreeing to participate.
It's a pleasure.
So as we do with everyone, we're going to begin the interview with some background questions for context only. If you could start off by telling me, where were your parents born?
In Poland.
Okay. And where were you born?
In Poland.
Okay, very good. And where did you receive your education? Elementary, secondary, any post-secondary?
I was born in Poland after the war, unlike my parents. I went to Polish school for 3 years, then we left in 1957. And then I had the rest of my elementary in Quebec, in Montreal, in English, as all immigrants virtually did in those days. High school in English in Montreal. University, I went to McGill, got my undergraduate BA, and then my law degree and a graduate degree in Russian literature. Then I did my graduate degree in law at Oxford. So I came back and joined the bar and taught at McGill and also practiced extensively. And taught at the University of Montreal too, I should say.
Okay, well, the next question, I mean, your reputation precedes you on your next question, but for the record, I'm going to ask it anyway. What is your occupation?
I'm a lawyer now. I was most of my life both a lawyer and a law professor.
Very good. And where do you live now?
In Westmount in Montreal, in the Montreal area.
Very good. Okay, now that we've got the contextual background questions out of the way, I'm going to get to what I like to call the meat of the matter here. And these are questions concerning your experience living in Quebec today. And I will start out by asking you, what is the best thing about living in Quebec?
I think the best thing about living in Quebec, I'd say two things. First of all, the fact that we have both the French language and the English language, and we can use them, and we have full cultural and educational and university facilities in both, and I've taught in both. And the other thing is the city of Montreal, which is a vibrant international city that I've always, since I came, I've always considered myself a Montrealer.
Okay. Now, the next question, a lot of people have had trouble with. Certainly, if it was posed to me, I would have trouble. But I'm going to ask you to respond in the way it's posed, and you're free to elaborate on that answer in any way you see fit. So having said that, describe your relationship to Quebec in a single word.
I consider myself a full member of Quebec society. I love Quebec. I participate. I hope I'm I always believe it's very important to be a good citizen and a good neighbor, put out your garbage at the right time, pay your taxes, obey the laws unless they're immoral, and contribute. And I'm an enthusiastic Quebecer.
Very good. Now, where do you feel most at home in Quebec? For example, in communities based on language, culture, profession, or geographic location?
Well, I feel most at home in Montreal. I've never lived anywhere else in Quebec. Though I feel, when I'm in Quebec City, I feel it's a very nice place and I could live there. I'm a big city person. I don't think I'd like to live in the country. But I am not one for identities or cultural groups or religious groups and so on. I feel at home everywhere in Quebec. I feel at home in the university context in Quebec, and both the French and the English universities. In both the French and the English world, my life is very much 50-50, and I speak both languages at home. And it's not. I simply feel at home here.
Okay. Now, the next question, I've had some feedback, so I'll share that with you. It's a two-part question, and the second part deals with the official definition in Quebec. And what I mean by that, people say, well, according to who? And it's really according to you, your perception of the official definition in Quebec. It could be defined by the media, by the various governments, but what you perceive to be the official definition of Quebec. So having said that, I'll ask the two-part question. How would you define a Quebecer? And do you feel the official definition in Quebec includes you?
I think a Quebecer is somebody who lives in Quebec in the long run. I mean, obviously somebody who moves in for 3 weeks doesn't become a Quebecer, he's a visitor. But anybody who lives in Quebec, works in Quebec, has his career in Quebec, is a Quebecer, regardless of language or origin or political views and so on. And I consider myself a Quebecer. I have no question about being a Quebecer. I do want to point out that Quebec, being a Quebecer, is not necessarily an exclusive thing. If you ask me a Canadian, I'd say somebody who lives in Canada, so I qualify as both. I'm a Quebecer, I'm a Canadian. I happen to be a citizen of Poland, but I'm not actually personally, presently living in Poland or having a day-to-day experience of being Polish. I'm a citizen of Canada, of course, and it's not a citizenship, but I am a Quebecer, very proudly a Quebecer.
Okay. Now, has your sense of identity as a Quebecer changed over the years? And if so, in what ways?
Well, you know, when I came to Canada, the two communities were completely separate from each other. There was very little contact with the French community. I wasn't even aware at the beginning that French was a majority language, although I came to know that in 60, 61. And even then I would ask myself, how is that possible? Because I've never met them, and I've now learned how to speak French. Where are they? And it was only during the Quiet Revolution that the two groups mingled. And so my definition became more Quebec-oriented, because before that I was in a little West Montreal English-speaking island. My relationship with Quebec changed because of the Quiet Revolution, which I admire and I think was one of the great lucky movements which allowed the two groups to mingle, to meet. I could not have married my wife in those days. And this civil code had a rule against people of different religious backgrounds marrying each other. And that, of course, went out the window during the Quiet Revolution, as did all the other restrictions. So, yes, I think my feeling about myself as a Quebecer evolved because of the Quiet Revolution. Now, all of that made me a proud Quebecer, somebody who wants to be a Quebecer and feels good about being a Quebecer. But all of that didn't make me an admirer of nationalism. I've never liked nationalism. I don't like Canadian nationalism, although that's not so, if you like, it's not so persistent. I don't like Zionism. I don't like Palestinian. I think living for nationalism, for a religious identity, is just not for me. I believe that all people should mingle and we're all individuals. And what I like about Quebec is social justice, which the rest of Canada shares too. It's the culture, as I said, French and English, but mostly French. And if you like, I became enthusiastic about Quebec because of the Quiet Revolution, but I think it's time to tone down the nationalism.
Okay. And that kind of leads me into the next question, which is, what are some of the most difficult things about living in Quebec?
Well, I've never found living in Quebec difficult because, you know, I'm just as much at home in French as in English. So I read in French half the time. In fact, I'm quite consistent about that. One book in English, one book in French, and an occasional book in Polish or Russian. But I've never found living in Quebec difficult. What I find maddening about Quebec is the obsession, for instance, the belief that the French language will disappear. Now, I think it was correct. It was necessary to pass Bill 101. But once the education system in French is compulsory for 90% of Quebecers, I don't think there is any danger. And I don't think there's any need for constant debates about what service to give in English, what service to give in Chinese, or whatever. So that's frustrating. I find nationalism frustrating wherever it shows up. And I can tell you that what I find, I've got friends in every milieu in Quebec, and there's a certain similarity, some people will get angry at me, between some of my Zionist friends and some of my Quebec nationalist friends. What they have in common is absolute blindness about one issue and total sophistication about the rest. They will have the same views about Yugoslavia, the same views about international human rights, etc. But on their favorite topic, neither of them is able to dismiss the emotional call of the identity.
Now, in recent years, some members of Quebec's Francophone majority have identified a number of linguistic and cultural threats. Which of these concerns do you share and support, and which of these concerns make you feel excluded or targeted?
There was a concern that I did share and supported, and not from at the beginning. At the beginning, I wasn't fully aware of it, but I thought it out, and in the 70s and in the 80s especially, I think there was a danger because all of the immigrants were going to English schools, as I had, and of course, although I ended up being completely bilingual. First of all, I think I'm not being immodest by saying I'm good at languages. But secondly, I married a French Canadian. I just melted into this, but it doesn't happen to everybody. So if all of the immigrants continued to go to English school, I think there would have been a threat. In fact, English school is what killed or practically killed the English communities in the West, in Ontario, the French communities in the West, in Ontario, in Louisiana. Welsh was a majority language in Wales in 1857. Britain passed, very good faith, very important, the Education Act of 1857, making sure that every person in the United Kingdom had an education. Sure, it's excellent, but it pretty well anglicized Wales because it was all in English and none of it was in Welsh. So I agree that there was that threat. But once Bill 101 was in place, there is no threat. Languages don't disappear because there is another language around if you have to go to school in that language. And of course, English, it's not a threat that way. English is today the dominant language. French was in the 19th century. When I see some newspapers tell us how to speak, don't use this type of Anglicism or this type of Anglicism, I wonder if they worry about us using laissez-faire, savoir-faire, so on, from the days when French was the dominant language. And, English may not always be the dominant language. For the next 50 or 100 years, it will be. But that doesn't destroy it. There's always a language which people use to speak to other people, more often than another. But French will continue, and French will continue to thrive. And in particular, of course, the particular fortune we have is that French and English are equal in terms of facilities. They both have all the full scale of scientific writing, medical writing, and extraordinary literature, which if you only know English literature or only know French literature, you're missing something. I suppose you'd also say that about German literature, Russian literature, but French and English are absolutely splendid languages. And there is no real threat at this point. I agree there was a threat when all of the immigrants were going to English school. I think it's still important for the immigrants and the Francophones to learn English, because in order to have a complete career in North America, you have to know English. I think it's absolutely essential for anybody in Quebec to know French. I mean, if you think you're going to live and have a successful career without knowing French, you're delusional. But I do not think there is a threat.
Okay, very good. So what in your mind do you feel is the biggest problem facing Quebec today? And if you identify a problem, how do you feel it could be resolved?
Well, I think there are all sorts of problems that we're faced all over the West. I don't want to put them in order. To me, the most terrible thing is inequality of income between people. And that's not Quebec particularly. In fact, Quebec may be slightly better than some other places, slightly. Let's not pat ourselves on the shoulder too much, but the inequalities, the unavailability of justice and the delays of justice, of course, the environment, which we can't deal with as an isolated Quebec or for that matter, as Canada. It's a world problem that will have to be dealt with through treaties and sacrifices. So these are three problems that are facing the world. I think the whole world is facing a crisis in which Quebec participates. And as I told you, each group doesn't see its own weakness. It's the identity and the wokeism stuff. We have moved from the period that was known as les Trente Glorieuses after World War II, when inequalities were reduced and humanity mingled and mixed and old prejudices fell. We've moved back into the cocoon of identity. And Quebec is only one place and not different from others. And you turn on the television, you see all over the world people, Myanmar, Palestine and Israel, Catalonia, Scotland, Quebec, people having, and the wokeness. The woke, the belief that you should have that your racial or cultural or ethnic identity is so important, or gender identity, and then you figure out that they tell you there's 80 genders, and I personally think there may be, there may not be. It's each person's choice what he wants to do. But I think the entire identity obsession of today's world is a threat to unity. I used in the book in which I published the metaphor of the Tower of Babel. When you're suddenly divided into all these groups, you can't build, you can't progress. When you think that the most important thing is maintaining your cultural identity, and I think Canada is guilty with multiculturalism, which is an error. What we should have, Quebec interculturalism is a far better thing than Canadian multiculturalism. The idea that there is a common culture, but that the others are welcome and they make their contribution to the common culture. But I think Quebec in particular faces the problem of its nationalism, of the sort of strange sense when you watch some of the plays, etc., the sense of nous autres, which is not a good thing, nor is navel gazing by English Quebecers, nor is multiculturalism by various groups. So I think that's a problem. So when you look at the world's problems today, I think the inequality, the lack of justice, the environment, are by far the most important ones, and they have to be dealt with, and we have to basically undo the harmful effects that neoliberalism brought about with the reduction of the civil society in the creation of the commercial society in its place. It's not an answer. But the particular Quebec problem of nationalism has to be seen in its context. Quebec is not the only place, and far from the worst place. You turn on television, you see 100 people killed here, bombs blowing up somewhere in Iraq. We don't have that, but it's still a problem.
Now, I'm going to just pause for a second and take a time out and ask you if you've had an opportunity to see the documentary, What We Choose to Remember, by Guy Rogers?
No, I didn't.
Okay, it's a great documentary. I really encourage you. I'm going to send you a link, Mr. Gray, because it's it's talked about all of the things you're talking about and how it's the history of Quebec seen through the lens of various stages of immigration in Quebec history and how we evolved to where we are today through those lenses. Yes. So I will send you the link to that, and you can watch it on your computer, your television, whatever you like. But the reason I bring that up is the director, who is a friend of mine, Guy Rogers, he used a very effective technique. It's a visual technique and tool in that documentary. And it was a show of fingers. That's why I'm asking this next question this way, because I'd like to use the same visual tool. So having said that, if you could indicate by a show of fingers on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being weakest, 10 being strongest, how strongly do you feel that the joys of living in Quebec outweigh the challenges? For the record, that's 10. Thank you very, very much. Now, is there anything else that you would like to say about your sense of identity or belonging in Quebec?
Well, as I said, I feel completely at home. I try to be objective and see each group's point of view. One of the difficulties with modern nationalism, and that again applies to the Middle East, it applies to Poland, it applies to all sorts of places, Russia, is that they only see their own version of history. So in Quebec, for instance, Quebecers have never completely repudiated Abbé Groux. Now, I don't think he was a bad historian. I think his point, he had some views that were unpalatable about Jews and so on. But I think as far as his view that the conquest saved Quebec, that Quebec would have been completely submerged in a North American thing without the conquest, is probably correct. But he had this very Catholic view that the Catholic Church and so on was essential. It's one view of Quebec history. Mm-hmm. There was a historian called Marcel Trudel, who wrote Myths and Realities of New France and Myths and Realities of Quebec, in which he needled each group. Each group had its own version. So, you know, how often you hear English Montrealers say it's their own fault. The church didn't allow them to have schools. There's some truth to that. Trudel says that, but it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is that they were conquered, and that there was an alliance between the British and the ruling classes and the church, as there often was in various places in the British Empire. An alliance between Britain and a portion of the population, whatever. But both sides are blind to the fact that there was, for instance, that very negative side, which had nothing to do with the British, and at the same time, that you can't blame Quebec. Blaming Quebec for its own history is a terrible mistake, especially since that history is not bad. I mean, if you look at Quebec history, I don't think anybody should be ashamed of what happened. There were different incidents that are better or worse. And, you know, the refusal of by many young people in 1916 or 17 to fight in World War I don't think I would have wanted to go to fight in World War I. It was a terrible war without a clear good and evil on either side. World War II was different because of Hitler. Hitler made it all quite different. But so there's nothing to be ashamed of. But what is important is that people read histories on both sides, and people read literature on both sides and see how in fact, I think we all have to take a step back and say, I see this not as a Christian or Jew or Muslim, English speaking or French speaking, but I just try to see it from all points of view and make sense of the historical and literary documentation that we have. all of that subject to the fact that, of course, each generation reinterprets history. And history as viewed in a, I remember in my high school, grade 11, there was a multiple choice question. Why did Britain not want to leave India? And there was A, B, C, D, E. And the correct answer was because it was afraid that the Muslims and the Hindus wouldn't get along. So out of the goodness of its heart, Britain didn't want to leave India. Now, could that answer be suggested today? That was the correct answer. So every generation reinterprets history.
We've come to the official part of the interview, Mr. Gray, and I want to thank you officially for participating. It's been great. Your points of view have been very much appreciated. Now, I'm going to turn off the recording. We'll have a brief chat.